Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to MetrObelisk Radio. Today we are taking a look at David Lynch's Dune. Now, if you're a fan of science fiction, you've definitely heard of Frank Herbert's Dune. If you're not a fan of science fiction, Dune is best described as Game of Thrones before Game of Thrones. So if Dune's original source material was Game of Thrones before Game of Thrones, then does making Dune into a movie do it any sort of justice? Or would it have been better off as just being a TV show? Now, before we get started, remember to follow the blog, metrobeliskradio.blogspot.com, where you can stay up to date on all Metrobelisk Radio uploads, no matter if they're exclusive to the platform that you are either watching or listening to this on. So with that out of the way, let's get right into Dune. Now, as always, we start off with each of these episodes looking off at the creative team. Now, this movie was written and directed by David Lynch. David Lynch is responsible for other movies and TV shows such as Twin Peaks, along with the movie for Twin Peaks. I think that was Firewalk with Me or something like that. I don't remember. All I remember is it starred David Bowie and it was a prequel to the show. Eraserhead, The Elephant Man, Inland Empire, Mulholland Drive, and Blue Velvet. And fun fact, David Lynch turned down George Lucas for directing Star Wars Return of the Jedi at the time and did this movie instead. Now, this movie is obviously based on the book by Frank Herbert. Now, he wrote the first 6 Dune books, and that would be Dune, Dune Messiah, Children of Dune, God Emperor of Dune, Heretics of Dune, and Chapter House Dune. Now, Frank Herbert died shortly after the release of the 6th Dune novel. I think the 6th book came out in 1985. Frank Herbert died in 1986. So his son, Brian Herbert, wrote the last 2 books to conclude the series, along with other books to expand the mythos. Now, the common criticism of Dune is that it doesn't lend itself well to on-screen adaptations, just simply because of how the books are written. I've personally never read Dune, but I did try to read it probably about 10 years ago, and just couldn't get into the book because of just how big it was. Now, before I get into the character analysis, I want to take a look at the production history for this movie, because this movie was not the first attempt at bringing Frank Herbert's Dune to the big screen. The first time that the film rights were optioned was back in 1971 by film producer Arthur P. Jacobs. Now, he was the producer behind movies such as the original Dr. Dolittle and all 5 Planet of the Apes movies, the ones from 68 going up through 73. Now, Arthur P. Jacobs had director David Lean attached to do it. David Lean most famous for, Bridge on the River Kwai and Lawrence of Arabia at the time. However, Arthur P. Jacobs would die in 1973 with the movie still being in development. Now, the rights reverted back in 1974, and this would be the most famous Dune movie that never got made. The film rights were acquired by a French consortium with Alejandro Jodorowsky attached to direct. Sorry, I forgot how to pronounce his name just then, had a brain fart. And bands like Pink Floyd and Magma were attached to do the music, more so Pink Floyd than Magma. Dan O'Bannon was attached to the visual effects, and artists H.R. Geiger, Jean Giraud, and Chris Foss were hired for set and character design. Now, as far as actors, Jodorowsky envisioned Salvador Dali, yes, the surrealist painter, as the Emperor, Orson Welles as Baron Harkonnen, Mick Jagger as Feyd-Rautha, David Carradine as Leto Atreides, and his son Brontis Jodorowsky as Paul Atreides. Now, this movie was scrapped for multiple reasons, but one of the biggest was that the funding had all dried up after Jodorowsky simply just wanted to make this movie a 10 to 14 hour epic. But not all of the ideas for this movie would be completely lost. A little science fiction movie called Alien would come out in 1979 and had guys like Dan O'Bannon and H.R. Geiger attached, and it was believed that a lot of the character and set design simply went to that movie instead of the 14-hour Dune movie. Now, speaking of Alien, Ridley Scott was attached to direct the Dune movie at one point. This is when Dino De Laurentiis stepped in as producer. Dino had Frank Herbert write a new screenplay in 1978, and the script that Frank Herbert turned in was 175 pages long, so effectively a 3-hour movie. And Ridley Scott was hired in 1979 along with writer Rudy Wurlitzer to write the screenplay. Now, the movies that he wrote that you might be familiar with are Sam Peckinpah's Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, and Little Buddha, starring a very young up-and-coming Keanu Reeves at the time, back in the early 90s. And H.R. Geiger retained from the Jodorowsky production. Now, Ridley Scott would drop out of directing this movie to go direct Blade Runner. Ridley Scott saying, quote, "But after 7 months, I dropped out of Dune By then, Rudy Wurlitzer had come up with the first draft script, which I felt was a decent distillation of Frank Herbert's book, but I also realized Dune was going to take a lot more work, at least 2.5 years worth. And I didn't have the heart to attack that because my older brother Frank unexpectedly died of cancer while I was prepping the De Laurentiis picture. Frankly, that freaked me out. So I went to Dino and told him that the Dune script was his. That was from the book Ridley Scott, Making of His Movies, written by Paul M. Salmon, and that was published in 1999. And that's how David Lynch got attached to directing Dune, despite the fact that he never read the book, never knew the story, or he was never even interested in science fiction to begin with. So this is going to make for a quite interesting experience. Oh, and a fun fact about this movie that I found while doing a little bit of research on it. This movie released on the same day as a David Lean epic. And that David Lean epic would be A Passage to India. And I personally found this to be really funny, knowing that David Lean was originally attached to direct a Dune movie. Now, he's competing directly with a Dune movie. Now let's jump into the character analysis portion of this retrospective, and we're going to start off with the man himself, Kyle MacLachlan as Paul Atreides. Now, he's our main character for this movie. He is the Duke of his family. His house is chosen to lead Arrakis in a place of their arch enemies, the Harkonnens. Then we have Francesca Annis as Lady Jessica, and that's Paul's mother. She's a part of the Bene Gesserit sisterhood in this movie. She was tasked with only birthing daughters, but going against the sisterhood, she gave birth to a son because she loved Paul Fathers enough to birth him one. And later in the movie, she is with child, and that child would be Paul's sister. Then we have Kenneth McMillan as Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, and he is the head of the Harkonnen family. He is promised an army from the Emperor to take Arrakis back from the Atreides as long as he would kill Paul. And then we have I'm going to mispronounce this name, Jose Ferrer as the Emperor. Now, he's not in the movie too much, but he's the one that's pulling all of the strings in the fight between the Atreides and the Harkonnens. He wants Paul dead because he fears that he'll drink the water of life. He doesn't want Paul to realize his full potential too early, so at that point, just whack him off. Next, we have Virginia Madsen as Princess Irulan, and she's only being brought up because she's the character that you see in the very beginning of the movie, giving you the backstory. Otherwise, she's the daughter of the Emperor, and she doesn't really get much screen time other than that opening scene. Then we have Sting as that Foyd Routha, and it's funny because the original they wanted Mick Jagger to play this role, so at least they got another musician. He's another one of the Harkonnens that's working with the Emperor. He's more of a brute type thing. And finally, we have a Patrick Stewart as a Gurney. Now, he's Paul's tutor on how to fight, and then later becomes an ally once he realizes that he was lied to about Paul's death. And yes, this was Sir Patrick Stewart about a few years before Star Trek The Next Generation came out. Now let's discuss the narrative of the movie. And when you look at the narrative for this movie, it sounds simple. There's two warring houses, the House of the Atreides and the House of Harkonnen. The Emperor of the Galaxy wants Paul Atreides dead. The way he sees Paul Atreides in an early grave is to send the House of Atreides to Arrakis to rule what formerly belonged to the House of Harkonnen. Now, the Emperor promised the Harkonnens an army to take Arrakis back as long as they kill Paul in the process. They think they kill Paul until he and Lady Jessica are saved by Freemen, the people of Arrakis who live out in the desert. It's when Paul becomes a Freeman that leads them to a holy war to purge the Harkonnens from Arrakis. Now, the issue that I have with the narrative of Dune is that it's too complicated for just a single movie to handle. There's a lot of political intrigue between the House of the Atreides and House of Harkonnen that doesn't really get looked at other than the House of Atreides has a traitor amongst them. Now, they try to get around this by doing a bunch of voiceovers with people, talking in their head, but I think it simplified the narrative way, way too much. And then that traitor I just brought up a second ago turns out to be the Doctor. But there wasn't enough buildup for that to be such a shocking revelation. Now, what's the importance of Arrakis, otherwise known as Dune? It's the only planet that grows melange, and otherwise known as the spice. Melange is used to fuel the entire galaxy's economy, and that's why this barren desert planet is so important to rule. But again, there isn't enough time that a movie can spend to get this point across. Now, you're hearing me go on and on and on about this war between the House of Atreides and House of Harkonnen. Does this sound like Game of Thrones in space to you? It really is if you look at the war between the Starks and the Lannisters. Now, the conflict between the Starks and the Lannisters was building over the course of multiple seasons, with other story threads going on at the same time. And this is why I'm saying that a movie cannot delve deeper into the political intrigue of the Atreides and the Harkonnens like HBO's Game of Thrones could with the Starks and the Lannisters. There just isn't enough time in a feature film to be able to pull something like that off very well. What you got is just a watered down experience of what should have been, Jodorowsky's 10 to 14 hour movie. Now let's take a look at how this movie was received. Now, this movie has a Rotten Tomatoes score of 52% based on 48 critic reviews, with the critics' consensus being, quote, this truncated adaptation of Frank Herbert's sci-fi masterwork is too dry to work as grand entertainment, but David Lynch's flair for the surreal gives it some spice. And this has an audience score of 66% based on 70,878 audience reviews. And this movie has a Metacritic score of 40 based on 17 critic reviews and a user score of 6.5 out of 10 based on 45 ratings. And this movie sits on IMDb at 6.5 out of 10 based on 121,983 reviews. Now, this movie was made on a budget of $40 million at the time back in 1984. So adjusted for inflation in 2020 dollars, that is a budget of $99,750,144.37. Basically, this is the equivalent of a $100 million blockbuster back then. If this movie were to be made today, it would have a budget of $100 million minimum. And the movie only grossed $30,925,690 worldwide. And if we adjust that for inflation in 2020 dollars, that is a worldwide gross of just $77,121,051.06. Now, David Lynch was in the writing stage for the sequel Dune Messiah, but due to low box office performance, the movie was ultimately canceled. And David Lynch apparently had signed on to direct Dune Messiah along with the third movie, and if we're going based on the books, the third movie would have been Children of Dune. Now, the Rotten Tomatoes score, Metacritic, and IMDb are all what modern audiences think of the movie. How was the movie received back in 1984? Roger Ebert gave this movie 1 out of 4 stars at the time, saying, quote, this movie is a real mess, an incomprehensible, ugly, unstructured, pointless excursion into the murkier realms of one of the most confusing screenplays of all time, and added, the movie's plot will no doubt mean more to people who have read Herbert than to those who are walking in cold. Roger Corliss for Time magazine said about the movie, quote, most sci-fi movies offer escape, a holiday from homework, but Dune is as difficult as a final exam. You have to cram for it. And Alejandro Jodorowsky saw this film as a result of his sons dragging him to see it. And as he saw the movie, he said that he was happy seeing that it was a failure. He did say that that was the fault of the producers and not Lynch himself, however. Now, David Lynch would completely disown this movie later on. When the 3-hour cut was made for television, David Lynch's name was not on the movie. Instead, it was the Alan Smithy credit. Universal has wanted to get David Lynch back to do a director's cut on DVD and Blu-ray, but has refused every time he was offered. David Lynch speaking on Dune, quote, I started selling out on Dune. Looking back, it's no one's fault but my own. I probably shouldn't have done that picture, but I saw tons and tons of possibilities for things I loved, and this was the structure to do them in. There was so much room to create a world, but I got strong indications from Marfella and Dino De Laurentiis of what kind of film they expected, and I knew I didn't have final cut, end quote. Since then, he refuses to speak about Dune in interviews. And I'm going to go ahead and end the episode off with this. The original source material is too complex to be made into a feature film. Now, Denis Villeneuve is taking the approach that Ridley Scott wanted to take, and that was to split the first book into 2 movies. With that one, we're going to have to wait and see if Warner Brothers will even really go along with something like that, knowing that Zack Snyder's Justice League was originally supposed to be split over 2 movies. I think Dune would have been better off if it were made into a TV show. If Warner Brothers were smart enough, they would realize that Dune could be their next Game of Thrones, given enough time. Game of Thrones is now over, and they're looking for something to take its place. Why not Dune? I know that HBO is doing a Bene Gesserit series to go along with the movie, as long as the movie performs well. So Warner could be planning on doing a multimedia franchise with Dune. How's that going to play out? We're simply just going to have to wait and see on that one. But if I'm going to give an opinion on that right now, just judging from the David Lynch movie, I don't have high hopes for the Denis Villeneuve movie that's coming out. I think it'll fall into the same restrictions that the David Lynch movie fell into, and that's basically there's only so much that a feature film can do versus a TV series in terms of looking into the political intrigue and all of the other circumstances surrounding the Atreides and the Harkonnens. But we will have to wait to see how Denis Villeneuve's Dune will turn out, and only time is going to tell with that one.